Go ahead and get started in a few minutes. If I could have everyone come in and take a seat, and we'll get started. Well, welcome back, everyone, and we want to thank all those people again who participated in our poster discussion session. It was very lively. It was great to see all those posters, and we want to thank those people that, again, who presented today. We're going to get started with our final session in today's meeting. This is session number 4. The theme is Emerging Developments in Propofol Sedation by Non-Anesthesiologists. And we have a great lineup of speakers for you. We're going to first hear from Dr. Egan, and he will talk to us about computer-assisted personalized sedation. Dr. Egan.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. It's great to be here. Have a long history of interaction with ISAP, and it has a warm place in my heart. So I'm very pleased to be on the program this year. As Dr. Johnson noted, I'm going to talk about computer-assisted personalized sedation, or CAPS, as it's known for short. And we're really going to explore the question of whether this is going to be a disruptive innovation in sedation practice. I come to you from the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. This is our Health Science Center with the beautiful Wasatch Mountains in the background. Want to invite you to come and visit Utah. Because this is such an international audience, I'll give you a little geography lesson. Utah is one of the square states in the west, where the X is. And we have beautiful alpine mountains in the north, skiing with my daughter last spring. And we have beautiful Red Rock Desert in the south. This is what's called a canyoneering trip with one of my sons a couple of years ago. Utah is a beautiful place. Not everybody can live there, but you're welcome to visit, and I'd love to show you around. Love to show you around the hospital sometime. And I mean that sincerely. I'd love to give you a little tour. I have some disclosures to make. I was a consultant to Scott Labs, which is the original inventor of this technology, and have a very small equity position with them. And I've also been a consultant and advisory board member to Ethicon Endosurgery for over 10 years. So I've been involved with this project a long time, and thus it has occupied a fair amount of my scholarly activity. So I certainly have some attachment to it that perhaps makes me more enthusiastic than I might otherwise be. So you'll have to interpret my remarks with that in mind. So just to give you a quick outline, we're starting perhaps 10, 15 minutes late, so I'm going to try to compress and accelerate my comments. I'm going to begin by talking about the Propofol controversy just very briefly. We all know what that is. Then I'm going to talk about the idea of CAPS being a disruptive innovation, and then we'll review the concept of computer-assisted personalized sedation, or CAPS, and then finally we'll just very briefly consider the implications for anesthesiology. I'm going to spend most of the time on a review of the technology, and I want to note that this is an unusual talk. As a professor of anesthesiology, don't usually stand before an audience and talk about a proprietary product and a single proprietary product. But this is a development that's important enough that I think as an anesthesia community we need to understand what this technology is and what it is likely to bring to the table and what the implications are for our specialty. So this is a little bit of a show and tell related to this device. And I admit at the start it's difficult to be balanced when you talk about a single product because there's nothing to balance it with. So you'll have to keep that in mind. So what about the Propofol controversy? It's been a considerable controversy, perhaps the biggest controversy in our specialty over the last 10 years or so. Anytime a gastroenterologist and an anesthesiologist are in the same room, This is the elephant that's in there with them. Who is qualified to give propofol and under what circumstances? And I want to just take you through some interesting documents, and I've got a whole slide case full of these that are an illustration of the debate that has taken place with regard to this propofol controversy. For example, here's a GI professional society position statement that appeared in numerous GI journals. It was a position statement by 4 GI societies, simply saying that, hey, the administration of propofol, when you compare it to standard sedation practice, has the same efficacy and safety profile. We're getting the same results with propofol as we used to get with benzodiazepines and opioids, only the patients recover faster. So we think it's okay, and we're moving in that direction. This is from 2009. You know that the professional GI societies got together and petitioned the FDA to change the propofol label, and the FDA, or the ASA rather, reacted to this position with this letter to the FDA, simply noting that the literature on gastroenterologists' use of propofol does not establish the safety of the practice. So the GI docs were saying, we think this is okay, and the anesthesiologists were pushing back and saying, well, not so fast. We're not so sure that it's a safe practice. Now, third-party payers have also been involved. Already 2 times, a major insurance company in the United States, Aetna, has announced that they would no longer pay for an anesthesiologist to be involved in a GI sedation case. And then they pulled back on those announcements and decided they'd continue to fund it for a time. But this article that appeared in the New York Times a number of years ago said, well, the FDA is going to approve some new devices and drugs that may allow us to revisit whether we're going to continue to pay for anesthesiology involvement. So third-party payers have also been part of this conversation. Here's an interesting development. This is from a GI trade magazine, something like our Anesthesiology News. This is an advertisement for propofol sedation for endoscopy suites. So these are groups of anesthesiologists and their business partners who offer a propofol sedation practice to GI doctors. And for many GI doctors and their practices, this has been quite attractive because they can gain the advantages of propofol without the liability and just not have to worry about the sedation. And here's the real interesting part. Some of these GI practices actually increase their profit margin because the anesthesia people come in, they can do maybe 1 more case every hour, and they can hire nurse anesthetists and bill for their professional services and then increase their profit margin because they don't pay the nurse anesthetist all that they collect. So the GI community is also divided on this issue. It's not that all the GI doctors want to do propofol sedation. Now this is where the world really got rocked. So this is a CMS letter, so that's the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services. This was a CMS letter to participating hospitals and other facilities that published new interpretive guidelines. And this essentially shut down the practice of nurse-administered propofol in most of the country. And in fact, some cease and desist letters were issued. This is a copy of a letter that was issued to a Salt Lake City-based gastroenterology practice that said, CMS views propofol when used for diagnostic or therapeutic procedures as a form of anesthesia. You don't have anesthesiologists in your facility, you've got to stop. So this really changed things in the United States, and even many of the, what you would consider academic and scholarly flag waivers for GI-administered propofol, even these people who dedicated their career to perfecting the art of propofol in GI endoscopy without the involvement of an anesthesiologist stopped the practice because this CMS letter essentially tied their hands. And of course, even the lay public knows that propofol is controversial because they watched the tragic death of Michael Jackson related to propofol misuse, and then the trial of Dr. Conrad Murray. And they became familiar with the potential side effects of the drug propofol and the fact that obviously some doctors are not qualified to give it. So it's fair to say this has been a very, very controversial issue. So what are the main facets? Well, there are political parts of it. That is, in some states, for example, the Nursing Practice Act prohibits nurses from administering propofol, so it's just not possible. There are regulatory barriers because the propofol label is very specific about who is qualified to administer propofol. There's a medical legal barrier for GI doctors and endoscopy nurses and so on to give propofol because they have some risk management burden associated with the off-label use. There are these financial issues that we talked about, that payers are highly motivated to constrain and reduce cost, and this elimination of the anesthesia professional fee from the endoscopy bill is a way to reduce cost, and so that motivates payers. There are workforce issues. It's widely acknowledged by both the anesthesia community and the other professional societies involved that there simply aren't enough anesthesiologists to provide all the sedation that's required to sedate patients undergoing just the GI procedures, not to mention all the other procedural sedation that happens in the United States. And then finally, there are patient safety issues. There are pockets and collections of safety signals that arise where there's been an index case, a catastrophe that has resulted in the disability or death of a patient. So let's talk now about the concept of disruptive innovation just briefly. So computer-assisted personalized sedation, or CAPS, I believe is likely to be a disruptive innovation. And that's sort of what we're going to consider here. Is it going to be a disruptive innovation? Let's consider what the definition of that is. So according to Clayton Christensen, who is a very widely and highly regarded Harvard Business School professor, who also happens to be from Salt Lake City, by the way, Clayton Christensen, who wrote The Innovator's Dilemma and who coined this term, disruptive technology or disruptive innovation, he defines disruptive innovation as something that creates a new market and then also a new value network, so a chain of suppliers and distributors that create a new business model. And this usually focuses on a new group of consumers. So the group of consumers that we'd be talking about here would be the GI doctors. And then this disruptive innovation or technology disrupts the existing marketplace, usually by lowering prices. So there's a competitive advantage where often you're delivering maybe even an equal or superior product at a lower price. And so this rocks the market significantly, and over a period of time, the disruptive innovation displaces the earlier technology. So as we talk about Sedasis today, which is the trade name for this generic technology, the first of this generic technology, computer-assisted personalized sedation, or CAPS, I want you to think about whether this will indeed be a disruptive innovation. Of course, it remains to be seen. Now, many of you saw 2 weeks ago this Wall Street Journal article entitled Robots versus Anesthesiologists. Johnson & Johnson's new sedation machine promises cheaper colonoscopies and doctors fight back. This was the subtitle. And among other things, this is a notable quote from the article. A new system called Sedasis, made by Johnson & Johnson, would automate the sedation many patients undergoing colon cancer screenings called colonoscopies. That could take anesthesiologists out of the room, eliminating a big source of income for doctors. Now, when physicians read this, and when a professional society representing anesthesiologists read this, this gets our attention. And I'm sure that perhaps many of you saw it, and there's been a lot of buzz, a lot of talk about it, and I know that our professional societies have reacted and written letters to the Wall Street Journal. And so this is sort of evidence in the lay press that there's a potential for a disruptive innovation. And even the title here sort of suggests that, robots versus anesthesiologists. Now here's a study that was published in JAMA last year that used an administrative database to investigate the potential cost savings if anesthesiologists were to be eliminated from routine screening colonoscopies. And it's a very interesting piece. Some have criticized it because it was in part funded by the makers of Sedasis, but it passed muster in JAMA and got peer-reviewed. And here's a notable quote: eliminating discretionary use of anesthesia providers during gastroenterology procedures could generate $1.1 billion in savings per year. Now, even in the grotesquely large medical bill that the United States pays every year, even with that perspective, $1.1 billion is a lot of money, and that gets the attention of payers. This is an adaptation of that article showing that there's a lot of regional variability about where anesthesiologists are involved, but this data only takes us up to 2009. So this was a retrospective review of this administrative database, and it shows that even by 2009, or in the late 2000s, the Northeast already had 50% penetration of anesthesiologists delivering sedation for gastroenterology procedures. The South a lot, the West not so much. Now there's a more recent modeling study that looks at current trends. This was published a couple of years ago in gastrointestinal endoscopy, and it projects that by 2015 the participation rates will be at least 50% in the entire country. So it's a growing trend. That is, anesthesiologists are being involved in the delivery of procedural sedation for routine gastroenterology endoscopy cases more and more. Okay, so now let's get to the technology. We've talked about the Propofol controversy. We've talked a little bit about whether it's going to be disruptive or not, and the trends related to that. So now we'll get to the actual review of what this technology is. And I know many of you have been following this and have been interested in it for some time. I suspect that it'll be new to some of you, particularly those of you from outside the U.S. And so we're going to give you a brief overview of the technology, and then we're going to talk about the pivotal trial, which was the main trial. There have been numerous trials of various parts of the technology, and then a preliminary sort of pilot trial to help design the pivotal trial. We're not going to talk about those. We're just going to talk about the main trial that was the primary basis of the FDA approval of the device. So the concept of computer-assisted personalized sedation, again, CAPS is what we'll call it from here on out, addresses many elements of the Propofol controversy, but of course it creates additional controversy as well. So the system is essentially comprised of three elements. It's a TCI-like Propofol infusion algorithm, not TCI, but it's grounded in kinetic principles, so it's intended to emulate TCI. It has a very sophisticated monitoring package, which we'll detail, and then it has a smart alarm system that can constrain drug delivery if problems arise. And of course, from the very beginning, the project has targeted the non-anesthesia market, and it was ultimately approved in May of this year. Now, I should tell you that this was a very arduous process. It took a long time to get this regulatory pathway hammered out. But ultimately, it was approved and will presumably be launched sometime next year. So here's a look, and I want to acknowledge and thank Ethicon Endosurgery, now a unit within them called Sedation, for providing me with some of these pictures, and in particular Dr. James Martin, who is their primary scientist involved in the project. So this is the procedure room unit, so this stays in the endoscopy suite, and this is the bedside monitoring unit. So this gets attached to the patient outside on their gurney. It comes into the procedure room and then stays with the patient during the recovery process. So this constitutes the pre- and post-operative monitoring, whereas this main monitor adds some additional monitoring components, which we'll get to shortly. So to give you kind of an overview of the technology, the basic idea is that this is a Propofol delivery system by infusion, not bolus, an advanced monitoring system, and then a smart alarm system that can constrain drug delivery if untoward physiology arises. So let's detail these components a little more. The bedside monitoring unit, this little guy here, has pulse oximetry, non-invasive blood pressure, and ECG. And again, this remains with the patient throughout the entire peri-procedure process. You'd get your baseline vital signs and your post-operative monitoring and and final discharge vital signs with this in place. The procedure room unit adds 2 additional monitors, capnography and something called an automated responsiveness monitoring. Now, in terms of the disruptive technology idea, Clayton Christensen notes that many disruptive technologies actually take off-the-shelf technologies and just repackage them and put them together in some way. And to some extent, that's true with Sedasis. But there are several elements that are unique. One is the TCI emulation dosing scheme. And the other, and of course that's only unique to the US, not to the rest of the world, but the part that is truly unique is this automated responsiveness monitor. So this is a way of really testing whether the patient has gone into a deeper than intended sedation state. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but these 2 additional monitors increase the sophistication of the monitoring beyond what's currently done. There's also an oxygen delivery system that is dynamic. Its rate can increase when there are problems. And Propofol cannot be delivered. This machine won't work if there's not oxygen being delivered, which was just a philosophical underpinning of the device. And I want to mention that this device was essentially developed by anesthesiologists. The Anesthesia Scientific Advisory Board that advised Ethicon endosurgery is comprised of about a dozen anesthesiologists, all of whom you would know well, and many of whom were president of ISAP at one time or another. They really guided this process all the way through. So it was meant to bring the best practices of anesthesia to the sedation world. And then, of course, there's the Propofol delivery piece of this procedure room unit. Now, let's talk briefly about the automated responsiveness monitor. So the automated responsiveness monitor is intended to determine what does it take to get the patient to respond. So there's a auditory response, and then a louder auditory response, and then there's a tactile response. So there's an earpiece, and there's also a little vibration piece for the hand. And this happens repeatedly and continuously, and it gets kind of stern eventually and telling you to take a deep breath if you're not. And if you don't respond in 14 seconds, then the patient is deemed unresponsive. This is a look at sort of how the system looks in sort of an idealized fashion for, these are the kind of marketing pictures you see sometimes. It doesn't look like a real GI suite, does it? You know, there'd be all kinds of junk around. So here's the procedure room unit, and here's the bedside unit. Now, this is an important study that was done by Doofus et al. That essentially was testing the